Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
We are opening our series that we are calling Yeshua within Judaism. And we're going to go back into deep roots of what we see in the first century. I wrote in a paper, I'm going to read to you in a moment what I wrote for a paper in school. When we studied this period of time, you realize between the Tanakh, the end of what we know as the Old Testament, the Tanakh, between that and the Gospels, there's a huge difference. We're going to dig into that time so we understand the Gospels, what came before that. And so we're going to have some surprises along the way. So let me read to you what I wrote for my paper. At the time Yeshua rose from the dead, many saints in Jerusalem were resurrected. Now imagine that someone who had died before Israel went into the Babylonian exile, all of a sudden wakes up and it is the first century. Well, he or she may have a few questions. Like, why is everybody speaking Aramaic instead of Hebrew? And where did synagogues come from? We didn't have those. And more importantly, how come we now have so many traditions and commandments? What happened that we now are so closed off to the nations? Did they do something to us? Remember, he died before the exile and before the Maccabees. We're going to get into those. Why are we dominated by so many foreigners speaking so many languages? Why on earth are we being taxed? And how come Jews are collecting the taxes? I'm beginning to get a little upset about this. Now, I'm starting to understand the patriotism that I see in everyone's eyes, calling to overthrow those foreign soldiers. I'm beginning to understand that. I can't believe that the office of the high priest can be bought. That would have been unthinkable in our time. And what's with all those called Pharisees? What they say sounds right, but man, are they showy. And don't even get me started on politics. I get dizzy just thinking about so many Roman governors. It's been tough catching up with all this history, but hearing that Messiah has come at this time, it actually makes a lot of sense. God really sent him in the fullness of time. The biblical faith that we encounter in the Gospels is vastly different than when we left off in the Tanakh. A closer look at it, though, reveals that this difference actually started in the Babylonian exile. Now, we may know that that's where synagogues started. They started in the Babylonian exile, and when they returned to the land, and they brought the practice with them. And it was a good practice, and it is a good practice. But there's a lot more that we can gain by looking at the biblical roots of first century Judaism. Typically, scholars go back to around the time of the Maccabees, around the time of the Greeks. But seldom do they go further back to the return of the exiles. I want to actually go even further back. I want to go into actual biblical books, biblical history, so that we understand the first century. Now, when we study the exile, the return of the exiles, a prominent figure is Ezra. We know the book of Ezra. and Nehemiah. Nehemiah has a section where he actually talks about Ezra. We also compile some of the picture from some of the prophets. Some of these prophets were actually post-exilic. So they ministered to the people of Israel after they returned back to the land. Some of these prophets are Zechariah, Haggai, and Malachi. The historical context in which they prophesied was actually after they had returned from Babylon. Now, they based themselves, both Ezra and Nehemiah and the post-exilic prophets, they actually gained a lot. They were based a lot on the exilic prophets. You see, the prophets who had their ministry during the time that Israel was in Babylon. So we have Ezekiel. Some of Ezekiel's ministry was actually in Babylon. If you read carefully, some of his visions that he actually had it in Babylon. Even before Ezekiel was Jeremiah. We know the book of Lamentations. The book of Lamentation is all about the destruction of the temple. So Jeremiah was an eyewitness to the destruction of the temple. So we will place him early in the exilic period. And then towards the end of that time, of their time in Babylon, we know very well Daniel, right? Daniel ministered the entire time he was taken as a teenager, actually, to Babylon. In all of his ministry, there is no indication that he ever returned to the land of Israel. That he stayed and ministered to the kings as they were coming and going, these kings. Finally, the book of Esther offers us another picture of tradition, how tradition was started, right? We have the Feast of Purim, all started in Babylon and observed universally in the Jewish world. So we have a picture of tradition and how tradition gets started in Jewish community. So a lot of our Bible, a big, huge portion of our Bible has as context the return of the exiles back into the land of Israel. So in order for us to understand the changes that we see when we open the Gospels and read about the Jewish faith in the first century, in order for us to understand that, we need to dig back into the time of the exiles and when they returned. And a key figure here is Ezra. I have a thesis for you today, if you feel like you want to be in school. Some of you are in school. So my thesis today is that the Judaism of Yeshua's time, of the first century, was characterized by four things. And I'm going to tell you in a moment what these four things are. So the Judaism of the first century was characterized by four things, and these four things can be traced all the way back to the Babylonian exile, as shown in the writings of Ezra. So, the Judaism of the first century has four components, and we can see these components in the writings of Ezra. Okay, so let's take a look at these four components. What are we talking about? First century Judaism was, first of all about the extension of temple standards to all life. We talked a little bit about this in our Torah study today. The extension of temple commandments to everyday life. We have a classic example is when they come to Yeshua and they say, Rabbi, why do your disciples not wash their hands before they eat? And we have several occasions, similar occasions in which they came to him asking him about his lack of observance of tradition. And Yeshua's answer to them is fascinating when we see it in context. We will return to this. We first need to gain a deeper understanding of Yeshua's context in order to appreciate his answer, how he interacted with them, even how he innovated within Judaism. Never left Judaism, neither did Paul, but how they innovated within it. So first of all, Judaism is all about the extension of temple standards to everyday life. So it's a constant invasion, I'm going to say it that way. It's a constant invasion that the standards of the priests are cast over the regular people. This puts incredible burdens on people. So a lot of the burdens that we see the Pharisees putting on people in the Gospels, it comes from this good intention of extending God's holiness to everyday life, but then taking it to extremes. When we open the first writings of Jewish tradition, the Mishnah, it goes into lengthy details of how and when not to, incredible details just on how to say the Shema. The intention, again, is to extend holiness to every detail of life. But unfortunately, based on rules and regulations and the teachings of man, Yeshua is going to come and offer a different model. And we'll get into that as we progress in our series. So, secondly, Judaism in the first century is all about a concern with not letting outsiders in. It's a concern with not letting outsiders in. In other words, community membership. Are you one of us? You see, that's the basis also of all the questionings about Yeshua. It's like, you dress like one of us. You yourself are like one of us. How come your disciples are not? So community membership, who is one of us? This concern with who is in and who is out is huge in understanding first century Judaism. Not only Pharisaic, but all of them. You realize that for the community that produced the Dead Sea Scrolls, for them, the Pharisees were not strict enough. You may think that the Pharisees were super strict, but the Essenes, the community at Qumran, they were actually far more detailed in their observance, if that was even possible. We also know about the Samaritans, right? The Samaritans is all about who is in and who is out. And we actually see Yeshua upholding those same standards when he interacted with the Samaritan woman. He even called another woman a dog. Can we swallow that? He said, this food is not for the dogs. Speaking of, she was actually a Canaanite woman. So she was one from the nations, living inside of Israel, but not part of Israel. So Judaism in the first century is all about this concern for community membership. Are you one of us or not? Don't we have that today? You see, for the ultra-Orthodox, the Orthodox are nothing. And for both of them, the rest are not even Jews. We'll get into some of the specifics when we at the conclusion of our message here. Same thing with Paul, right? Paul was accused of bringing Gentiles into the temple. Big no-no. Not only the court of the Gentiles, but that he was accused of bringing them into the places where Gentiles were not allowed. By Judaism, by the way, not by the Torah. So this extension temple standards and keeping people in or out, they come together to shape up what Judaism was. Third is that they were all about their relationship with Gentiles. It's all about trying to figure out, how do we relate to Gentiles? You see, because in one way, the Gentiles are those who oppress us. So there's bitterness, and there's this desire to overthrow them. And that's not all bad. We'll get into that also in our series. But they're also concerned with pollution. Even the Jews who lived in the diaspora, who lived in the Greek world, we catch a glimpse of that in books like 1 Corinthians, where there is a concern with, how do we relate to the meat that we buy in the market because it was offered to idols? How do we keep ourselves from being polluted by these Gentiles while we live among them? So there is this great tension and concern. Not only are they our oppressors, but we also live with them and we can get polluted by them. But then there's also some who fall into complicity with them. We see those who condemned Yeshua in complicity with the Romans for their own gain, for their own political gain. Those are the ones who always try to position themselves in the politics with Rome. The part that we see in the Gospels. This started with the Greeks way, at least 200-300 years before what we read in the Gospel. So this is not new. And we need to know that and understand that. But then there is a desire to reach out to Gentiles and actually convert them. Yeshua, speaking to the Pharisees, he said, you go to the ends of the world to make a convert, and at the end, you make them far more a son of hell. This is actually what Yeshua said. Than they were already. And one of the things that we see in that is that there were efforts to reach out to non-Jews and bring them over into Judaism. So there is this uncomfortable relationship with the Gentile world, right? We hate them, we want to convert them, we want to get in their good graces, and we don't want to get polluted by them. So all in one relationship. And number 4 of the things that Judaism was all about is that Judaism was all about prophecy. It was all about catastrophic, prophetic end time. The name for that is apocalyptic. See, there is a difference between eschatology and apocalyptic. We get the book of Revelation in English, right? In Greek, it's called the Apocalypse. That's the Greek name for that book. What's the difference then between the end times, between eschatology and the apocalyptic? Well, if you recall, all of those apocalyptic movies, they're all about huge worldwide catastrophes. That is the hallmark of the apocalyptic. So when you go from simply considering, what would happen to, what happens to the soul when we die, where the Jews go, or even like the parables of Yeshua, right? When he talks about the rich man and the poor man, and they died, and one, went to Abraham's bosom, and so this is eschatology. But when you bring in the end times and the catastrophes that will usher in the end times, how the Messiah is going to deliver Israel from the oppression of the Gentiles, when you get into that, then you're no longer into eschatology, or maybe you're in a subset of eschatology called the apocalyptic. Now, we don't see a whole lot of that coming out of the Pharisees. The Pharisees themselves were not very apocalyptic. We see a whole lot of that in the Dead Sea Scrolls, though. And there are many other streams of Judaism prior to the time of Yeshua that was very apocalyptic. And there are many books that we have today, actually. We will get into some of those that show tremendous development in the apocalyptic. Yeshua stands in contrast to the Pharisees because he was very apocalyptic. And again, we're going to get into a lot of that. So the four things that Judaism was all about: the extension of temple standards to everyday life, the concern with not letting outsiders in, their relationship with the Gentiles, and catastrophic apocalyptic eschatology. These are the four things that Judaism was all about. And when I say Judaism, normally we think of the Pharisees, but I'm talking about far greater, a greater conception of many other movements within the Judaism of the first century. All of these four things actually began in the Babylonian exile. And we see in the writings of Ezra, we see the seeds, the beginnings of these four things. Now, when I say the writing of Ezra, you're probably thinking the book of Ezra. Why doesn't he say the book of Ezra? Well, the reason why I'm trying to purposely be a little wider in general is because Ezra is the most likely and, quite frankly, the only candidate as the author of 1st and 2nd Chronicles. Now, 1st and 2nd Chronicles begins with the history. It begins with the genealogy of Adam. The first word in 1st Chronicle is Adam. Adam, Seth, and it goes on. And so perhaps that's why we don't know this book all that well, right? They have about 10 chapters of nothing but genealogy. Boring. But what's interesting is that the book of Ezra has a lot of genealogy as well. And this is one of the ways that you can tell that Ezra wrote 1st and 2nd Chronicles, because they have the same emphasis. When the genealogies are presented in both books, they're almost identical. Now, 1st Chronicles goes a lot more in depth. He starts with Adam. But when it gets to his contemporaries, Ezra mentions quite a few things that are found as well in 1st Chronicles. For instance, in Ezra chapter 2, I'm going to give you just a few references here. In chapter 2, verse 36, he talks about the priests. In verse 40, he talks about the Levites. In 41, the singers, the sons of Asaph. We know them from the book of Psalms, right? They wrote a few psalms, the early sons of Asaph. Verse 42 of Ezra 2, he talks about the sons of the gatekeepers. These are the temple gatekeepers. In 43, he talks about the temple servants. Now, realize this. He's writing already about those who return back to the land of Israel. And he is listing those who in the new temple that they are rebuilding, right, which is the second temple, he's listing those who are serving in that temple. He's talking about the priests who are his contemporaries, and the son of Asaph, and the gatekeepers, and the temple servants. But these are people who were born in the exile. So what was going on in the exile for them to continue the knowledge of how are you a gatekeeper at the temple when there is no temple? We're in Babylon, and years have passed, temple is burned, destroyed. Same thing with the servants, the priests. So there is a lot of knowledge, a lot of activity going on in Babylon to pass down Judaism. To pass down Judaism. Another key is the genealogies there are a couple of places. I'm going to read you. In Ezra 2, verse 59, it says, "Now these are those who came up from Tel Melah, from Tel Harsha, from Keruv, Adan, and Immer, but they were not able to give evidence of their fathers' households and their descendants, whether they were of Israel." You see, this is the concern with who is in. Who is one of us? Can you prove? Do you have the genealogical proof that you're actually a Jew? This is the beginnings of what we see in the Judaism of the first century. So the emphasis in the Judaism of the first century with the concern with who is in, who is one of us, began when they returned from the exile. So the temple emphasis, this concern with extending the commandments of the temple to everyday life began with their emphasis on the temple as they returned from the exile. Ezra 4:1, it says, "Now when the enemies of Judah and Benjamin heard that the people of the exile were building a temple to the Lord God of Israel, they approached Zerubbabel, who was the leader, it says, and the heads of father's household, and said to them, 'Let us build with you, for we, like you, seek your God. And we have been sacrificing to him since the days of Esarhaddon, some king of Assyria,' it says, 'who brought us up here.' But Zerubbabel and Yeshua," this is not our Yeshua, this is another Yeshua, who was the high priest at the time, actually. So Zerubbabel and Yeshua and the rest of the heads of the fathers household of Israel said to them, 'You have nothing in common with us in building a house to our God, but we ourselves will together build to the Lord our God of Israel, as King Cyrus, the king of Persia, has commanded us.'" So you see there, again, this emphasis on you have no part of us. You are not one of us. But also this relationship with the Gentiles, because what happens afterwards is, it says, "Then the people of the land discouraged the people of Judah and frightened them from building, and hired counselors against them and frustrated their counsel all the days of Cyrus, king of Persia, even until the reign of Darius, king of Persia." So here goes the relationship with the Gentile world. They are oppressing us. We have tons of governors, tons of soldiers. Anything we want to do here, we got to ask permission of them. This is the beginning of that. And the books of Chronicles show us that, as well as the Assyrians and then the Babylonians came and destroyed and conquered and took captive many of them. Let me show you another aspect of this. In Ezra 5:1, we have a wonderful passage here. It says, "Now, our God, what shall we say? What shall we say after this? For we have forsaken your commandments, which you have commanded us by your servants the prophets, saying, the land which you are entering to possess is an unclean land with the uncleanness of the peoples of the land, with their abominations, with their which have filled it from end to end, and with their impurity." So you see an emphasis here, a concern with clean and unclean, purity and impurity, which is going to cause them to emphasize this extension of the temple cleanness and holiness. They make a covenant in Ezra 10. We don't have time to get into the details of it, but you are familiar with this. They discovered that many of them had actually married with the women of the land who were not Jews, and they made a covenant to abandon their wives and the children that had come out of those relationships. So they went to great lengths to do that. And they actually make a covenant, and they say, whoever does not follow this, whoever does not do this, we will exclude them. They're Jews. They're getting after them because they are Jews, and they married with the Canaanite women. But here's the exclusion. If you don't do this covenant with us, you are out. You see the beginnings of Judaism here. How this in or out dynamic, it includes Jews from the beginning. Let's see. Looking for a passage that I think I may have edited out. Probably did. But I want to show you real quick some of the content of Zechariah's prophecy. So you get the fourth aspect of Judaism, this prophetic emphasis and this catastrophic end-time events. Just a summary of Zechariah. It says, a summary will be like, in chapters 9 through 14 of Zechariah, he is speaking about the Messiah and Israel's future. So in chapters 9 through 11, he talks about the coming of the Messiah in chapter 9, the restoration of the people of Israel, and the rejection of in his first coming, then the rejection of Israel of Yeshua as the Messiah. Then in chapters 12 to 14, we see the repentance of Israel. Chapter 12. In 13, we see the restoration of Israel. And then in 14, the reign of the Messiah. But the way, the details in these prophecies are these catastrophic, apocalyptic figures and symbols of the end times, and how Israel is restored from the oppression of the Gentiles. Daniel had already spoken about this. The end time restoration with the destruction of all of these kingdoms. These are the beginnings of the apocalyptic view of the end times. So you see how in Ezra, in Chronicles, in the prophets that we know, we have really the roots and the origins of what Judaism came to be. So why does this matter? Why don't I bring you an easier meal to digest, right? Something that will be like you can walk it out, right? Sometimes people say that you know that that somebody's preaching when they start talking about your behavior and how to change it. But I said nothing about our behavior and how to change it, did I? But I believe that these things have practical applications, and they are important because our behavior comes out of what we believe. So if you actually want to modify the behavior, you need to go into what you believe so that then it can be walked out in a natural way. So these things matter because, number one, it matters for our understanding of the Gospels and the epistles. There's great confusion about the place of the Torah in the life of a non-Jewish Messianic believer. This is very practical. I'm here, I'm not a Jew. What am I supposed to do? What am I not supposed to do? Some people say this, other people say that. I want us to be a model congregation in this area. And in order for us to do that, we need to talk about these things. We need to have them clear. We need to have a clear, in-depth understanding of what this whole thing called Judaism is about, so that we know our place and are confident on who we are. It matters for our understanding of Yeshua's innovations within Judaism. How was he similar and how was he different and why? So that we, again, have a foundation that gives us confidence in the things, in the way that we teach, the way that we interact with people, even the way that we witness to people, to Jewish people. It matters for Jews today who are rejected because of their faith in Yeshua. It matters to them. It matters that we understand where this rejection comes from. What are the origins of this? And it matters for Gentiles who seek to worship in a Jewish way and are trying to find identity and acceptance. And how not to go overboard and seek this identity and this acceptance in an improper way. Many have done this. This matters. This understanding, this in-depth understanding is important. And we have a part to play in our movement if we're willing to talk about these tough issues.
Good. That's right.
And have clarity so that we can lead. Amen. So we can be an example and we can teach. We can speak about these things with assurance. It may not be the most practical message that you've ever heard, but I'm confident that you will walk away sensing that you have better foundations for where you're at and where you want to go. Amen. 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 Amen.